Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live stream today. My name is Laura Michael Balderson, and I work for the Education and Visitor Programs Department here. And I will be moderating our discussion on agriculture and the Monticello Plantation with Brandon Dillard and Derek Wheeler. So to get started, let's have you two tell us something about what you do here at Monticello, what your jobs are. We'll start with Brandon, and then we'll have Derek.
Great, thanks. So I'm Brandon Dillard, and I'm the manager of historic interpretation in our Education and Visitor Programs Department. I do a lot of things here, and I've been here for 10 years, so I've enjoyed the opportunity to do a lot of things. Mostly, though, I work with our guide staff and working on how we tell stories about the past and a little bit about the content. And I've also had the honor to work with our Getting Word oral history project over the past few years. And in the time I've been here, I can also say that I'm happy to have learned a lot, and a lot of that I've learned from this guy. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Wheeler, and as a research archaeologist at Monticello, that means I'm in the archaeology department. I started out working in the field, and then I moved into the lab, analyzing the data we get, the artifacts that we uncover. Most recently, and what I love to do, is to actually look at Jefferson's writings with the modern topography to find out how Jefferson made his Monticello.
Wonderful. Well, let's dig into some questions here. As many of us learned as Virginia school children, many early Virginia plantations grew tobacco as a cash crop. Did Jefferson follow that same pattern?
So yes, Monticello was initially a tobacco plantation, and it's important to note that Monticello, the land that is Monticello, was a plantation before Thomas Jefferson was born, plantation after he died. It was a plantation that was initially patented by his father, Peter Jefferson, and Peter Jefferson patented this land in 1735 on the condition that he improved that land. And so that means that for Peter Jefferson, he had people enslaved on the land growing tobacco prior to Thomas Jefferson's birth. Now, Thomas Jefferson was born on this farm. He grew up on this plantation. He eventually inherited his father's wealth. That includes the land and the people he enslaved. And throughout the course of his life, Jefferson primarily lived on this plantation and expanded it. And it went from the initial 2,500 acres that he inherited from his father to a 5,000 acre plantation at its peak. That's almost 8 square miles. Now, Jefferson was a tobacco planter, and in the early years, the people enslaved here grew tobacco. But in later years, they switched to wheat, and wheat became the principal crop for this plantation.
Can you tell us about that switch to growing wheat here at Monticello, and how did it affect the organization of the plantation, the calendar of productivity, things like that?
The plantation was radically transformed when Jefferson decided to move to wheat. And the current image I think you can see is a view of Monticello with Monticello Mountain with the forest behind that. If you take away 99% of those trees and turn that into agricultural fields, that would have been something closer to what Jefferson would have seen and recognized. And if we go to the next image, see that Jefferson, when he was Secretary of State, this is an image of tobacco growing quote, where Jefferson realized that as Secretary of State, there's going to be war. Decide by telling his manager, let's grow wheat. However, it doesn't really occur until a couple years later. And in the next image, we will see that Jefferson was right that wheat does start to skyrocket in price at the time. It actually starts increasing in price from the year he was born, and then goes into almost until his death. The price keeps increasing. So yes, when he makes a switch, wheat starts going up dramatically. So when we look at the next image, we see that that when Jefferson first makes the switch, he is still growing a little bit of tobacco and a little bit of wheat. And Brendan, do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, a lot of this story, it tells us not only about Monticello and the specifics of this plantation, but also the broader context, as Derek's talking about here, the global context, the global economy, things like wheat fluctuation, tobacco fluctuation, and then the specifics of that and what that actually looks like for people living on this plantation, that manifests in a lot of different ways. And when we think about the people who are doing the physical labor, Jefferson has ideas about the best ways to maximize the capital from the plantation industry here. But of course, the people who are primarily tasked with the labor are enslaved. And throughout the course of Jefferson's long life and throughout the course of his time running this plantation, he has almost 50 men who he hires as overseers, whose job is to control the enslaved people who are producing the cash crops. One of those overseers, and only one, was a member of the enslaved community himself, a man named George Granger. And George Granger Sr., in the late 1790s, the time period that Derek was alluding to, talking about Jefferson's return in later years and changing the principal crop here, you actually see a little bit of overlap. When Granger is the overseer, there are multiple crops being grown, including a principal cash crop, wheat, but also tobacco. And with Granger's story, a lot of this we have to glean from letters that are written from Jefferson to his son-in-law and talking about what's happening on the plantation itself. But with this insight into Granger, we can see the insight of a man who is living in between two worlds. This is a Black man who's been given the task of caring for other people who are also enslaved and making them labor to produce principally the crops for Jefferson. And there's a lot to his role here, and he does it for a few years. He is paid for that work drastically less than what a white overseer would be paid, but more than what other enslaved people are paid for other labor. And it's an interesting insight and hard to imagine what his life was like in making these decisions. The writings that we do have about it show that there are different attitudes and different ways that people are treated. And for Granger himself, one of the complaints from Jefferson's white family is that there was a lot of insubordination, that people who he was telling to do this work would sometimes resist that work. Remember that all history is from the perspective of whoever is writing it, and when we're looking at it, we have to think about what's actually happening there. For Granger, we can interpret there are a lot of possibilities. And we do know that when he dies a few years later, the circumstances of his death, worth noting that 200 years ago, a lot of people got sick and died young. He died relatively quickly. And with that, the final African-American overseer at Monticello. And for the subsequent 26 years of Jefferson's life, it's a string of hired white overseers. There's a change in the production itself. There's a change in the way that people are asked to labor, from tobacco itself, which is primarily gang labor that requires sort of the same repetitive work and everyone does it the same, to wheat itself, which is a more diversified type of production that requires specialization for each individual.
And as far as the layout of the plantation, if we look at the next slide, when Jefferson does return from Secretary of State in 1793, he finds his plantation is in deplorable condition. As an absentee landowner for 10 years, his managers were doing the best they could, but they weren't really caring about the sustainability of the farm. So Jefferson comes home, finds out, yeah, these fields are just not organized well. So he goes on a campaign of surveying his mountain, his fields, his agricultural fields. And if we go to the next slide, we see one of these surveys with a transcription next to it of his very first day of setting out from Monticello and going out into the fields to see what he basically takes stock. What do my fields look like? And we see in the bottom right image of this image, the map of the field. This became known as the ancient field. And the blue annotations are notes that were included in his surveys that could be added to this particular map. So we have this one field. It doesn't supply a lot of information, but Jefferson went out over a dozen times in the next 2 years to continue to survey his mountaintop farm. And if we go to the next image, we see this larger map of the agricultural fields as they existed in the mid-1790s. And we have that ancient field labeled in the top left that he did a particular survey of. And then adding these other dozen surveys, we get a map of the fields. And there's enough information in those surveys that we can then overlay this map on top of a modern digital topographic map. So if we go to the next slide, we see where Monticello is situated. You can see where the ancient field lies and the rest of the agricultural fields running down the spine of the mountain. With that stippling area we're guessing where the remaining forested areas on Monticello Mountain. So we can then do the same thing for Jefferson's other quarter farms. He had, as Fraser Nyman mentioned a couple weeks ago, Jefferson had 4 quarter farms to manage the farm efficiently. And if we go to the next slide, we can see how all the agricultural fields were laid out across his entire 5,000-acre plantation. Within this switch to wheat, Jefferson didn't just say, okay, let's just replace tobacco with wheat. Let's just grow monocrop. He realized that the fields, since the fields were in bad condition, that just starting to grow wheat would not be sustainable. So he introduces crop rotation to try to improve his lands to make the overall farm profitable for his entire lifetime. And with this, Jefferson toyed around. He read various books, European handbooks on crop rotation, what was the best methods. He wrote a lot of people, including George Washington, what is your method of crop rotation? How do you do it? And he came up with different schemes, anywhere from a 4-year crop rotation to an 8-year crop rotation. But it appears that the 6-year crop rotation was what he settled on most of the time. And within this scheme, on each one of these 4 farms, he would have, as a result, 6 agricultural fields. And any particular year, he would have 2 fields in wheat, 1 in corn, and the rest in clover or in fallow. So that would mean, and sorry, I should also mention, each of these fields were 40 acres. So each one of the farms was about 250 acres in size. And if you times that by 4, there was about 1,000 acres of agricultural fields, a quarter of which, 250 acres, roughly, were put into wheat any particular year. And I think on the next image, if we go there, this is just in his Jefferson's farm book. This is a calendar of his crop rotation scheme. And if anybody happens to know what, I think it says P period O period means, I'm not quite sure what that means in the calendar. Wheat, WH clearly stands for wheat, corn is spelled out, and CL for clover, but I haven't been able to figure out what that last one is. So if there are any viewers out there that maybe it's Latin, I'm not quite sure. But anyways, let's continue on to the next slide, please. Okay, and there was also a lot, Jefferson asked for advice, he read books, but there was also a lot of trial and error. And this particular set of letters shows that when they made the switch to wheat, one moved from hoe-based agriculture to plow-based agriculture. And it didn't always go well. As you can see, that for the first 10 years or so of growing wheat on Monticello, the farmers would plow the enslaved laborers would plow the fields in whatever direction was the easiest to plow the field in. And that might mean doing rows and furrows up and down the hill or at an angle, but very rarely following contours of the land. And as Jefferson notes, in this hilly environment that he lived, one needed to do contour plowing in order to preserve the soil. So Jefferson's switch to growing wheat, and crop rotation was meant to preserve the land. However, that first 10 years rapidly degraded the land. And once again, I'll refer to Fraser Nyman's talk from 2 weeks ago, where he mentioned that archaeologically we see this in the ground, where during the tobacco period, we see erosion rates occurring in the fields, but them rapidly, tremendously increasing once that switch to wheat occurred. And however, once contour plowing was introduced, they tried to minimize that erosion and ameliorate the fields. All right, great. Next slide. All right, here's an overview of Jefferson's plantation, and I think we're ready for any questions.
So we've talked about some big picture things here about how this agricultural pursuit is taking place across the plantation. But what did that mean more specifically for the typical workday for the enslaved people who were doing this labor in the fields?
Sure. I think, all of this, it gives us insight into the people. And I think a lot of what Derek talked about there is a great insight into how Jefferson's mind works too, because Jefferson is always thinking of the next plan. He's thinking of how is he going to maximize this? How is he going to make this most efficient? And one of the things that he actually comes up with is a system for the ways in which this wheat harvesting and wheat plowing is going to work. So as Derek mentioned, tobacco farming, this is something that's done primarily by hand. This is you're hoeing these small hills in order to grow the tobacco, whereas wheat planting requires the plowing of a large field. And so Jefferson writes about this. And the tobacco planting, everybody who is doing field labor is doing the same work. With wheat planting, it's different. And he has this idea of how he's going to make the whole thing work as this machine where everything will function in equilibrio, as he says. And in so doing, he's going to have different people doing different tasks, but all at the same time. And so while there are going to be women who are working in the dirt below and hoeing in the fields and plowing in the fields, you'll have men next to them who are literally threshing the wheat, somebody driving an ox cart. That ox cart's going to have a scythe sharpener. Remember that this cutting is happening by hand with these large sickle blades, and that person is going to be sharpening the blades. So there's never a need to stop, and there's never a need to take a pause to sharpen any of the tools or to rest, and it can just keep going, and it's a complete disaster. Jefferson has this great idea about how this is going to work, but he never accounts for any of the human variation without thinking about the fact that the people who are involved in this process are going to slow up, they're going to speed up, slow down, and they're going to watch out for one another. And so it does move in equilibrio, but not exactly as Jefferson expects. And so these are Jefferson's ideas. And then the reality of how enslaved people are actually able to perform those ideas is based on them as people. And in that, we also see some of the lie of slavery itself, which is the idea that people can be treated as machines. We don't know that much about the specifics of people who are living and laboring in the fields, comparatively speaking. Monticello as a plantation is one of those places where we know so much, because Jefferson wrote down so much, and because he was Thomas Jefferson, which means that what he wrote down was kept and protected by historians for many years. But when it comes to the people who are working out in the fields, and as you saw with the maps that Derek showed, this is a big place, people who literally are miles away from the mountaintop here at Monticello, working out in these fields, it's hard to say. But we do know some specifics because Jefferson's keeping records. He's writing things down. So George Granger Sr., the overseer I mentioned, he has a big family. One of his sons, a man named Bagwell Granger, marries a woman named Minerva. And the two of them are field laborers. We know because we know the standard act of any field laborer would be to wake up early before the sunrise. They have children of their own. Now, Bagwell and Minerva Granger are both going to labor in these fields according to the labor that they're tasked to do. And perhaps Minerva Granger leaves her younger children with one of the other women on the plantation enslaved, but considered too old to do the physical labor, but not too old to do labor, which means that she's caring for the children who are too young to do labor themselves, which means under the age of 5. And so we can imagine Bagwell and Minerva Granger working in these fields, doing this from sunup until sundown, various kinds of tasks associated with the wheat production, and then at the end of the day, returning to small log cabins. And Derek made the point of saying that this change in agriculture has a profound impact on the landscape, on the plantation itself. It has a profound impact literally on the lives of the people who are enslaved here, not only in their daily labor, but even in how they live. And over time, we see that even the structures in which enslaved people are living, from large communal houses, are changing to smaller single-family homes and close to where they are laboring. And archaeology here, it gives us a lot of information about the group of people as we learn more and more by finding where these homes were and by learning about the people who lived in them.
So you mentioned various tasks associated with the wheat harvest. So for people like myself who have never farmed wheat, can you talk a little bit about how wheat is grown and then harvested?
Sure thing. With the wheat fields were first plowed in the middle of the summer. With Jefferson mostly grew winter wheat, almost exclusively what was called winter wheat. And that was generally put into the ground in September. And that gave the wheat a chance, since wheat is a grass, it likes cool weather, it grows best in cool weather. It gave the chance for the wheat to establish itself in the fall, before winter came. And then it lied dormant throughout the winter and then started growing again in the spring, which meant that the field themselves, there wasn't much happening after the wheat was planted in September. Jefferson did mention at times interspersing the wheat field with clover in spring, so that would mean some additional plowing in between the wheat rows of wheat, and adding the clover in. But otherwise, the wheat was then harvested starting in June. And then it was, yes, as Brandon mentioned, a variety, pretty much it was all hands on deck. All the enslaved laborers were pulled out to the fields to harvest the wheat. And Jefferson had this idea that since he lived on a hilly plantation, that each field should have its own barn, granary. And in that consisted of a 2-room structure with a passageway in between. And what they would do is people would cut the wheat, it'd be put into sheaths, and then be hauled in a wagon to the barn and stacked around the barn. Then it would be the tops of the wheat would be broken off from the stalk and thrown into one of the rooms. And then it would sit for a while, and then it would be threshed. At some point, Jefferson purchased in the mid-90s, I think it was 1796, when he first received and built his first threshing machine. And then the wheat would be threshed in that open passageway between the rooms of the barn, and that removed the wheat from the chaff. And then the wheat was then thrown into the other barn. And then during the wintertime, the wheat would then be gathered, and after Jefferson had completed his manufacturing mill, the wheat would be hauled by wagon down to the Rivanna River, and there the wheat would be ground by the miller. It would be placed in barrels, and then the barrels would be shipped by boat, bateau boats, from Milton, which was about a half-mile downriver of Shadwell, to Richmond. There in Richmond, Jefferson had an agent who would try to sell the wheat at the best price, where it would be then shipped off to Europe for consumption.
Thank you. So sort of 2 questions here. One is, did the same enslaved people do all of these jobs? And then sort of my own question is, during that period when the wheat is dormant, what did the enslaved people do during that time of the year?
Yeah, so different enslaved people did different work with the wheat harvest, and that's one of the ways in which it is pretty different from the tobacco harvest, but everyone is working, right? What's interesting is that you begin to see a development of specialization with members of the enslaved community, and specialization sometimes that's concentrated in families and passes down from generation to generation. And you also see that different people learn how to do different tasks over time, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And a lot of this stuff is recorded in Jefferson's own records, also sometimes in family letters. And sometimes we even see that continue in generations after Monticello. We have family records and oral histories that talk about work done here that passes down. And the family that immediately comes to mind is actually also tied to that Granger family, which is something that's another reality for Monticello and all plantations. For the most part, when people are kept in a small locale, they do what people do, and they have families together. And here at Monticello, you have 4 or 5 generations of different enslaved families living together, having families together. And over time, eventually, the families become entangled through marriage and through bonds of kinship. Now, the largest enslaved family at Monticello is the Hemmings family, and the Hemmings family is related virtually to every other enslaved family on this plantation. Jefferson enslaved over 600 people throughout the course of his life, 400 of them here on this plantation. And so I've already talked about 2 generations of the Granger family. We can talk about another generation of that family, which is Wormley Hughes marries a woman named Ursula Granger. Wormley Hughes is a member of the Hemmings family. His grandmother was Elizabeth Hemmings. Wormley Hughes is a highly trained, highly specialized gardener here at Monticello who's actually working on the ornamental farms, the vegetable gardens at the top of the mountain. And that's something that he received specialized training for, very likely as a very young man when he's 13 years old, from a Scottish gardener named Robert Bailey. And that passes down. And we have oral histories from the Hughes family today where they talk about how this knowledge of gardening and plants is something that goes from generation to generation. The second part of your question there, Laura Michael, of what do people do in the winter? It depends. And it depends on, again, the work and the harvest, but important to note that at no point are people ever allowed to simply take time off. That's not how it works for slavery. And with the tobacco harvest, tobacco itself has to be dried and processed, and a lot of this work is done during the winter. We have records of George Granger talking about that in the first tobacco harvest, where Jefferson and his family are talking about how the tobacco harvest itself is damaged throughout the winter because it wasn't properly stored. But there's a lot of labor that goes into that. And when it comes to the wintertime, there's a lot of labor to maintain a plantation. Any large plot of land requires a lot of work. And that's actually something that we talked about recently that is something that's still true today. To maintain land and manage land, it takes a lot of labor. The labor at Monticello 200 years ago, enslaved men were during the winter times going out and cutting trees and felling logs and creating this wood for the fuel for the plantation, but also for the structures of the plantation, also for the fencing around the plantation. So constantly working.
And I will just add that once the transition to wheat occurs, as I mentioned with crop rotation, you have multiple crops growing at the same time. So not all those crops were on the same schedule as the wheat schedule. So that, and plus you needed farm animals to do the plowing. So suddenly you get more diversification. In Jefferson's calendar, his work calendar, he had 3 categories: horses, oxen, and laborers. So it was not only the horses that did the plowing, but you also had to take care of those animals, as well as the plowmen running the plows behind the horses. And for one example of Brandon mentioning there was no stoppage of work in the plow schedule for the horses, there was probably a third to a half of any given year was turned over for plowing, was reserved for plowing. And Jefferson writes of all of his acreage that there's 6 spare days within that schedule of plow days. So if it was too rainy, too snowy, or whatever, there was only 6 days of leeway within his yearly schedule to allow for bad weather. Otherwise, the plowing would be behind schedule.
Can you tell us, Derek, a little more about the mills that were constructed here at Monticello?
Sure thing. And the main point is mills. Jefferson it was one of his ambitions to establish what he called a manufacturing mill. If we go to the next image, please. We see that here's that same map of the agricultural fields, but with all the mills marked out as well. Jefferson, when he first inherited the Monticello plantation, he also inherited what was called a toll mill from his father that was built at Shadwell, probably at the same location that the manufacturing and toll mill is shown on this particular map. However, there was a huge flood in 1771. It seems to have been it imprinted on everybody's mind that that was the largest flood that had ever occurred for that generation that experienced it. And it wiped out Peter Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's father's toll mill. Thomas almost immediately thought, hey, I need to rebuild this. A toll mill was a mill that ground wheat or corn for plantation use. And it would also could be used to grind the wheat and corn for neighboring plantations for a toll. A part of the crop was kept as the toll for grinding that. And when Peter Jefferson first put his mill in 1757, it was the only toll mill in the area. So it was used extensively. So Thomas Jefferson obviously wanted to replace it. However, he had this good idea that he thought if he extended the canal from about a quarter to a third of a mile to 3/4 of a mile, which you see pointed out where the mill dam is, that he thought at a shelf of rock, a place where there was a small rapids, that he could extend the canal to that spot and he wouldn't need to build a dam, that there would be enough drop in elevation. However, since the canal was so long, and unfortunately, since he had to blast through rock, or his enslaved workforce had to blast through rock, that the edges of the canal were jagged and uneven, and that slowed the water down the canal's route. So Jefferson realized, no, I have to have a dam built. And we mentioned a minute ago what happens during the wintertime for the enslaved workforce. Another one of the things the enslaved workforce had to do over the winter, December, January, February, is go and stand in that water and build the dam. That was one of the assigned tasks for the winter of, I think it was 1803, 1804, when that was being constructed. So it was, that's where part of the field labor force went that particular year. Jefferson starts to build that canal. I already kind of gave it away. He starts to build the canal until early 1800s. Part of it's from being an absentee landowner. Part of it is unable to get good gunpowder. He ends up going with somebody named DuPont in Delaware, and they had the best gunpowder, blasting powder, to blast the canal out. And then while he was president, he finally gets the canal finished and starts to build the manufacturing mill, which was meant for grinding the wheat crop, solely the wheat crop for export, the stuff that was shipped down to Richmond and then sold and shipped off to Europe. So Jefferson finally concludes all of that in the middle of his presidency, and it finally gets under operation. And his first two millers, he wanted to lease out his manufacturing mill, and his first two millers were named Shoemaker, and they ended up not being the best millers out there, and they ended up having to break their lease partway through. And that was something that plagued Jefferson throughout the rest of his life, was finding competent millers to take over the manufacturing mill. And it came to a point where the neighboring plantations didn't want to bring their wheat crop to this mill because it wasn't functioning properly, adequately, quickly. It wasn't grinding the wheat quickly enough. Wheat crops not the entire crop would get processed, or it would get lost, and other things. So Jefferson, that was not the best enterprise, and just the canal cost $20,000 to construct. The mill itself was another $10,000. And that first lease was for 5 years at $1,250 a year. So just if he was able to keep that up, even if he was able to keep a miller in there year in, year out, there wasn't enough time to pay for the construction of these two items to pay for themselves. So it was a kind of a failed enterprise on Jefferson's part. He tried other options. He built another toll mill. Finally, during his presidency in around 1803, 1804, he finished his toll mill and replaced the toll mill that was destroyed 30 years earlier for grinding the neighborhood corn crop, wheat crop. And he also tried building a sawmill, and this was at the base of Monticello Mountain. And it was also kind of a combination mill that could also grind gypsum, which was used as a fertilizer for fields, and for a threshing machine as well for threshing the wheat. So it was a very busy complex down there on the Rivanna River at the base of Monticello Mountain.
All right. So we've talked about some expensive endeavors. We've talked about cash crops. Big question, did the cash crops provide enough of an income to sustain the plantation? Was the plantation successful monetarily the way that Jefferson hoped it would be?
Once again, the short answer is no. And I showed you that graph earlier on that showed that wheat prices were going up throughout most of his lifetime, although obviously year in, year out, there were fluctuations. For example, during the War of 1812, you had some British ships sailing up and down the Chesapeake, preventing any exportation of wheat. And on those particular years, wheat could not be sold. And Jefferson ended up using that export wheat to feed his plantation because there was just no price on which he could sell it. But generally during his lifetime, it would sell between $3 a barrel and $15 a barrel. And if wheat was if it was always great yields on his plantations and also high prices, he may have been able to sustain his farm. But he knew that wasn't even practical to assume that would happen. He wished it would happen, but he couldn't assume. So he tried to diversify his economy fairly early on, coming back to when he came back to Monticello in the mid-1790s, he started nail production on Mulberry Row. And this meant bringing enslaved boys at the age of 10 and inserting them into the nailery. And their job was from sun up to sundown to produce nails. And Brandon, do we have any information on some of the individuals that work there?
Sure. I think some of the most profound stories that we tell here about people who labored at Monticello are about some of the youngest people. I think it's worth really underscoring that we're talking about children who are 10 years old. And if you were born a slave at Monticello, you didn't have a job until you were 5. And if you were under the age of 5, then you would be cared for by one of those older members of the enslaved community. When you reach the age of 5, you would help take care of those children until you were 10, at which point you were given a factory job. And if you were a girl, you would work in a textile shop, turning fibers into cloth. And if you were a boy, you would work in the nailery, for example. And this work was done from age 10 until age 16, and Jefferson and the overseers paid very close attention to the productivity of each individual. And if they deemed that an individual was productive, then at the age of 16, they might be trained in an artisan trade. If they deemed that the individual was not productive, then they would be what Jefferson called sent into the ground, meaning that they would become a field laborer. We have a lot of instances of individual people who perform across the whole spectrum of how Jefferson deems their productivity. And some of them exceptionally productive, who end up producing so much that they do become artisan tradesmen, and others who don't produce as much. I think that where Jefferson would write about this as frustration, what we can say when we look at that today is that we can easily imagine situations where maybe people didn't work that hard on purpose. Forms of passive resistance wherein enslaved individuals might not want to work in the main house with the Jefferson Randolph family. And whereas the material possessions that were allotted to enslaved domestic servants were quite different from what the daily life of a field laborer would be, there's still a little bit more of relative autonomy. Recognizing the agency of enslaved individuals within the system is recognizing the ways in which people negotiated the system. A great story that we tell often at Monticello, and it's a hard story, but it really shows, again, the insight into the realities of the situation. A man named James Hubbard. And when James Hubbard is first tasked in the nailery, Jefferson describes him as being not particularly productive. And yet, over the next couple of years, he becomes one of the most productive. And Jefferson, like many plantation owners and slaveholders in the Upper South during this time period, is considering the idea that maybe incentive is a way to increase production. That being said, it should be noted that while Jefferson said that the whip should only be used in extremities, he did specify that the whip should be used. And slavery here at Monticello, just like slavery everywhere else, is a form of forced labor. And so that threat of violence, physical or psychological, is ever present. For James Hubbard, he worked hard. He made some small amounts of money on the side, a very small amount of money, which was not uncommon as well in the Upper South as part of these incentives. And when he turned 21, he bought himself a jacket and he ran away. He tried to escape slavery on this plantation. He was eventually apprehended. He was close to Washington, D.C. When an enslaved person ran from Jefferson, he would often put an advertisement in a newspaper to reclaim his lost property. It did not take long for Hubbard to be identified. He was brought back to Monticello in chains. And then 6 years later, he ran again. And this time he went and he lived in the Shenandoah Valley on the other side of Virginia. And he was gone for a year. While he was away, Jefferson sold him. And that also wasn't uncommon as a form of punishment and as a way for a slaveholder to rid themselves of property that they deemed dangerous. Hubbard was sold, but when he was apprehended, he was again brought back to Monticello in chains, and this time he was publicly flogged in front of his companions. When he was sold, he disappeared from our records. It's a hard story, but it's an important story because, again, it provides insight to the fact that slavery is slavery everywhere, and even here, that took a form of violence. There's another story about two young men, Brown Colbert and a man named Carey. His last name, we don't know. The two of them are working in this nailery, and it's important to envision what this is. This is hard physical labor done by hand. You're literally working with a raw iron material that you're beating with a hammer over an anvil with fire. And it's entirely staffed by these children, aged 10 to 16, all boys. So sometimes they play jokes on each other, pranks, and on one of these occasions, Brown Colbert, he hid Carey's nail rod. Remember, the productivity is monitored. If he can't be productive, that has a major impact on his life. That fight got serious. That fight escalated, and eventually Carey took a hammer and he hit Brown Colbert in the head and he knocked him out. Jefferson was away at the time. And as Derek mentioned, Jefferson was an absentee landlord for much of his life. He had a 40-year-long political career. The overseer sent a letter to Jefferson to tell him what happened. Jefferson's response was that he needed to make an example of Carey to strike terror into the others and to sell him so far south. It will be to those of us who are living on the Monticello plantation as though he were put out of the way by death. When Frederick Douglass wrote about slavery in later years, he said the greatest fear for an enslaved person was not the fear of death. It was not the fear of violence or punishment. It was the fear of separation. It's a hard story, but it's one that reminds us that that was used here as a punishment as well. Jefferson, he wrote about slavery his entire life. He called it a moral abomination. He called it a deplorable crime. Jefferson never wavered in this. He said slavery was wrong. And yet, he also continuously wrote that he could not find a way to extricate himself from the system. Thomas Jefferson once said these words: "The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passion, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and the most degrading of submissions on the other." When he said slavery was a moral abomination. He was speaking from personal experience.
Those are tough words to hear, but other endeavors that Jefferson undertook, I mentioned the manufacturing mill. That was an opportunity that he saw when he first conceived of the idea. There weren't any manufacturing mills in the area. So he thought this would be a great way to make money. In fact, during his presidency, when he finally finished the mill, a competitor arrived, a man by the name of Henderson, who was just downriver. And he started to build a dam and mill. And Jefferson secretly had an agent purchase all of Henderson's land, and as well dismantle the dam that he had built. And he bought the mill stones that were going to be placed in that mill, and he brought them over and stuck them in his manufacturing mill. So he thought, okay, not only will I make money, but I will get rid of the competition as well where possible. We see that the amount of money that he spent constructing these two things, the canal and the mill, never paid for itself. And so finally, the last thing that he tried to do was, especially when he became vice president in 1797 and then president, he realized that if he left again, his fields would go back to being farmed unsustainably. So he thought a way to deal with that was to get tenant farmers or people to lease large chunks of his plantation. And so during his entire presidency from 1801 to even after his presidency to 1810, he had someone named John H. Craven lease 500 acres that consisted of both Monticello and the Tufton Quarter Farm. And so it was kind of a more simplified farming scheme of 5 100-acre fields, 5-year crop rotation. But it also didn't include just land. It also included the animals of husbandry, the plow horses, the plow oxen, but it also included almost 50 enslaved individuals as a part of that lease. And you, Brandon, have any stories about that?
Yeah, we talked earlier about the Granger family. And so Bagwell and Minerva Granger and their children are living on that part of the Monticello plantation. And so they still legally are the property of Jefferson. Effectively, they're the property of Craven through this lease. And it shows how, for an enslaved person, the realities of their day-to-day life are really dependent on the economics of the plantation itself. For a short period, there's an overseer here named William Page, who's described as a violent man. And this is by Jefferson, and his family would describe this man as having tendencies towards aggression and striking fear into enslaved people to such an extent that other plantation holders in their surrounding area would not lease enslaved people who they owned to farms where Page was going to be working because of his violence. And Bagwell and Minerva Granger are working on one of the farms where he is the overseer for a year. And then they're transferred to another farm where George Granger is the overseer. So literally Bagwell Granger's father. And it just shows that there's a lot of change over time, and people have really just different experiences. And when we talk about the Monticello plantation, so much of this shows us that the Monticello plantation, it changes. It changes a lot throughout the course of Jefferson's long life, and then in the years that follow.
And finally, just I may add quickly that a part of that lease was for the enslaved individuals that were included, that Jefferson was told that Mr. Craven wanted the enslaved population to not live where they currently were. He doesn't specify where he wanted them to live, at least we don't have in the letters, but Jefferson tells his farm manager, to remove the houses to wherever Craven wants them. So part of this upheaval is not just moving from farm to farm, but it could be year in, year out at the whim of the person leasing the property on where they wanted you to live. And one of the interesting things that we're trying to do in the archaeology department is to figure out exactly where at Tufton that these individuals were placed, and to see how or Jefferson and Craven differed in their land management strategies and their farming strategies as well. John H. Craven ended up being a very successful farmer, and he ended up buying mills and owning thousands of acres in the area and was renowned as a good farmer. And it's interesting that it'd be interesting to see how his labor practices differed and how it was expressed in the material culture of the enslaved individuals that were put under his, I don't want to say care, but under his release during his tenure here at Monticello.
Well, Derek, that sounds like maybe a topic for a future live stream. We'll check back in with you. Thank you both for joining us today. We are out of time for today's program, but we appreciate you both being here, sharing your expertise with us. Thank you to all of our viewers for joining us as well. And we hope that you will join us again next week for a live stream on astronomy with Bill Barker.